this was perfect timing with you coming on the program today. And folks, if you haven't read this already, get over to The Athletic and make sure you're subscribed for all of Murat's great content and the rest of the Athletic team. You leaned on some of the Athletic team in other areas to talk about what a potential return for Mark Scheifele might look like. Fill us in on how this was put together, and then we'll kind of talk about some of the teams that might be interested.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think it was the last time I was on this show. I sort of was like, hey, one of the ideas I have is to explore Mark Scheifele potential trade returns. You said, yes, do it. People listening said, yes, do it. And so I went ahead with that. Traditionally, what would happen in this situation, and I've done this with Andrew Kopp, I did this with Jacob Trouba a couple years ago. You know, you look at comparable people who have been traded in recent seasons with similar production levels, experience, contracts. You come together with a sense of what you think that player is worth on the market. I think I did a pretty good job with Andrew Kopp, and I think I did a really good job with Jacob Trouba if I go back to 2019 and the line in the sand for what Winnipeg could get back for him. Mark Scheifele is such an interesting situation where, you know, with Kopp and Trouba, we knew, or at least I feel comfortable saying we knew that trade was coming. In Scheifele's case, I still think that I'm open to the possibility that he doesn't get traded and he's part of the Jets next year. It's still important to talk about. So I want to read to you kind of the pitch. I reached out to a whole bunch of different writers at The Athletic with teams that have cap space, that have talked about looking for offense. And I said, I've taken a first go at estimating trade value for Mark Scheifele, completely open to being told that I'm wrong. You know, here is vitals. I go into Scheifele's contract, 2 years left on it, just turned 29 years old, point per game for 6 straight seasons. Yes, there are defensive flybys. In some cases, I compared him to a poor man's Jonathan Huberdeau, where the offense is phenomenal and the defense leaves you wanting more. I suspect a good situation or a coaching change or a change of scenery could help him. And then I come up with a list of trade types that I think Winnipeg would enjoy, would benefit from. And if you're willing to hear me out, I got 5 models. 1, Scheifele for a first-round pick and 2 A-type prospects. And that one reminds me of Claude Giroux being traded at the trade deadline. Scheifele obviously has more term left on his contract. It's not the trade deadline, though, and so I thought that was a reasonable start. Scheifele for a first-round pick and an early 20s player who could project as a second-line center or moving forward from there. Same deal, a first-round pick or somebody who could serve as a top 4 defenseman with room for growth. An established top 4D like an Ivan Provorov, for example. And also a Scheifele for Scheifele, a situation where maybe there's someone else in another market with 2 years left on their deal, but it's a good deal. They're a productive player, all of that sort of stuff. And these are the types of things that I personally thought would be good jumping off points for trade conversations and what Winnipeg could get. And what I found was that a lot of people, at least the writers around the league, are really cautious at 2 years left of a 29-year-old center known only for or primarily for offense. And if you read the piece, I was a bit humbled and disappointed, I would say, by the trade returns thrown around for Mark Scheifele.
No, I mean, I saw the way you prefaced it before people went and started to read it. So we were sort of prepared. And I'll say this. I think we always at times somewhat overvalue what we see on a daily basis. And I don't think that's unique here. I would say the same thing in all the other markets. So when you're having these conversations, everyone is beginning from a position, not necessarily in the middle, but either on one side or the other. And the art of making a deal and the general managers are kind of getting to that spot that probably is a little bit more different. But what was the feedback? I mean, have we overestimated Scheifele's value in the National Hockey League just based on his points? Is there a reputation that's been damaged that has hampered his value? I'm interested in the feedback before we get to actually what was in these quote unquote offers as to what the word outside of Winnipeg is on Mark Scheifele. And I mean, are they trading him at a low, or does the production and the contract outdo anything that might be negative or risk when it comes to 55?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question because at Scheifele's contract, 6.125, he can score like he does and give back defensively, and he's still a valuable player. And I want that to be clear as well from my perspective. But going around the league and talking to folks, I do think that there's a little bit of a leaning on recent history, and certainly their viewings of Scheifele over the last couple of years during the regular season, the defensive effort and impact hasn't been there. And I think that folks are leaning on that pretty heavily, and maybe not looking back to that 20-point, 14-goal season or playoff round that he had in 2017-18 during Winnipeg's run of the Western Conference Final. Maybe not valuing the offensive production, which is very real as well. The coldest, iciest thing that I received in response to, hey, we got a top center, on the market, who would be interested in that. One response, who I won't attribute, said, well, hey, if we acquire Mark Scheifele, won't we still need a top center? And there were people who agreed with that perspective, that the shine has really come off and the defensive misgivings have really sort of taken over in some people's perspectives. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there are reasons to think his value isn't astronomical. 29 years old, his next contract will be well into his 30s. He'll probably be looking to get paid. Most of his value comes in points. There are defensive issues, all that sort of stuff. But I also think it's important not to get too carried away with that, because guys who can play the kind of minutes that he has and who have put up a point per game over 6 consecutive seasons, still doing it, even in a so-called disappointing offensive season, he crossed the point per game threshold. There are a lot of reasons to think that somewhere in this league, there are multiple general managers who value him more than perhaps my colleagues did in today's piece, or it's on me and I'm the one getting this wrong and Scheifele's not worth as much as I think he is.
Okay, let's get back to the way you laid out the potential types of returns for the Winnipeg Jets. In your opinion, if you're Kevin Cheveldayoff, which one of those scenarios is best for the Winnipeg Jets in their current situation? Is it leaning more on futures and getting another first-round pick, or are you looking for maybe a 1-for-1 or a 1-for-2 of not prospects, not the future, but guys you can hopefully come in and, maybe in a different way than Mark Scheifele was, but help the Winnipeg Jets win games and be better in the areas that they think they need to improve in?
Look, if the plan is to win now, which I believe that it is, like let's say Scheifele gets traded and Dubois is in the fold, there have been no issues. Perhaps there's even a long-term contract there, right? This is an important consideration, is that Scheifele doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's team building. But if this team is trying to be competitive and trading Mark Scheifele, they need a center. They absolutely need a center, not a prospect, not a maybe, not a third line who could be a second line someday, but they need if not a 1B type, somebody who can fill that second line role. Now, does that come specifically as part of the trade return? Does that come somehow on the free agent market or what have you? I'm not sure, but they can't go into next season with Cole Perfetti as their second line center without an upgrade at wing to make that whole thing work. Or Adam Lowry or David Gustafsson, or you could go through the various options that have played center for the Winnipeg Jets. So they would need that help. So my perspective is the easiest, in quotes, because it's not easy, trade return that works for the Winnipeg Jets if they're trying to compete is built around an early 20s established NHL player who isn't as good as Scheifele, but can fill that second line role and perhaps grow a little from there, plus futures of some kind, because on in a 1-for-1 situation, I would hold Scheifele's value as greater than that. You can look at the same type of model involving a defenseman, but Winnipeg has so many defensemen that they're already in that situation. Sure, they could take the upgrade, but then that necessitates a second trade or some other wheeling and dealing. I really think that if there's some type of center acquisition plus futures, that's how you survive a Scheifele trade for the time being and still try to win.
What do you think the likelihood, if they do get some sort of a deal, that it's bigger than just Mark Scheifele? We spent, you just referred to it. I mean, you could bring another defenseman back in a trade, but that just makes a crowded blue line even more crowded, especially with all the young defensemen that are sort of knocking on the door, some that will not be waivers exempt, which create a real problem if you want to keep all those guys. Might the Winnipeg Jets use the Scheifele chip to get what they want, but also potentially kill two birds with one stone and maybe move a defenseman in that deal as well?
That's one thing that I wonder about. And in speaking with Ian Mendez at Ottawa, he suggested the same thing. What if there's a way to, in his case, bring back Dylan DeMello, who I think that a lot of folks are realizing how valuable he was to Ottawa. Winnipeg did great to pick up DeMello for a third and extend him, and now he's playing, essentially top pair minutes with Josh Morrissey at even strength at the very least, and that's an important role. From Winnipeg's perspective, you're probably hoping to clear cap space somehow else. DeMello's a viable option, perhaps, but maybe it's Nate Schmidt, maybe it's Brendan Dillon. I'm not sure. Those are ways to move a veteran in that same sort of move, and maybe that allows another team to consider giving up more in terms of assets. The only thing is, I don't know that strictly in terms of how sexy of an acquisition it is because the offense isn't there. I don't know that a DeMello, a Brendan Dillon, or a Nate Schmidt really substantially add to the trade return that Winnipeg's getting. It would be more about, clearing space, and then perhaps Winnipeg ends up with, another veteran forward who can help but is not paid, is maybe paid too much, or is maybe not that impactful of a player. Like, I just can't see that being the deal breaker in a trade from where I sit today.
Murat of The Athletic is with us here on Winnipeg Sports Talk Daily. We're discussing his latest piece in The Athletic on a potential Mark Scheifele. Where could the Jets trade Mark Scheifele? 5 potential destinations. Of the 5, which was the most attractive return from your colleagues? The one that would make you consider, yeah, maybe this is a deal that would help the Winnipeg Jets, and I'm in.
Absolutely. I mean, there's 3 that I don't think that I would consider at all were I Winnipeg. I'd hold on to Mark Scheifele without batting an eyelash. There's one from Pittsburgh that I begin to think about, but in terms of sincerely evaluating this and looking at it as a possible moving forward perspective, is what Charlie O'Connor suggested from Philadelphia, and that's something built around Ivan Provorov. And that would be a player who has played top pairing minutes in Philadelphia. And yeah, he gets, he's had trouble with that a little bit, but as a top 4 defenseman, he's had success. He's 25 years old. He has 3 years remaining on a solid contract. I think it's $6.75 million, if I remember what Charlie wrote. And there you have a need to make a secondary trade to move a defenseman. But Provorov is the goods in a lot of ways. There's a top 4 defenseman there. Same with Travis Sanheim, if he's the centerpiece of that. And then Charlie talks about other types of futures or situations that could help make that work. But I just value Philadelphia's quality and diversity of assets, and the fact that they're genuinely trying to sort of rebuild on the fly over there. That if there's something that's going to fit, the Flyers sound like a fit, and Provorov was a particularly appealing piece for me.
If the Winnipeg Jets are, and listen, many people have different opinions on this. I still haven't really moved off the fact that there are some significant changes that need to be made amongst the leadership group, the culture of this team. And, he, for a number of reasons, is a guy that I think is at the top of the list trading, also because of the return. If the current return, if a deal like we just talked about isn't there, and the deals that we're talking about is a couple of prospects and a first-round pick, if they did do that, what does that mean for the rest of the offseason? We already know that Paul Stastny is going to make sure that he's available to pick up the phone from all NHL teams on, I believe, the 13th when free agency starts. Like big picture, long term, some of those things could absolutely help you. But if they do make a trade like that, how do they go into next season without having, at least in the meantime, when that deal is made, having a successor to maybe not score? I mean, I highly doubt you'll have someone that'll come in and score at that level, but play important minutes in the top 6 and, not have too much of a drop-off overall for the club, even if you might not be scoring as many goals.
Yeah, it becomes an immediate hole. And, for all of my criticisms of Scheifele's defensive impact, based on the contract, based on the production, that's an important player. And you miss his offense the day that it leaves. You absolutely do. And there aren't immediately viable backfilling options on the Winnipeg Jets. Like, are they counting on, in that scenario that we're sort of just talking through, would they be counting on Cole Perfetti to, in his first full season, not only stay healthy but produce offense and play in the middle, as opposed to the wing or some sort of slower transition into a top 6 role? man, that sounds like a tough ask. That sounds like too much of an ask if you're looking for my opinion on that. So then you probably look to the free agent market if you can find a stopgap of some form. You look to other transactions or trades, because Pierre-Luc Dubois you can see as a viable top center of the top two, but you need another one. Other than that, you're looking at, okay, then you're also trading Dubois and you're trading Hellebuck and you're thinking about a rebuild in full. I don't know if the trade return is that low. I think maybe Winnipeg holds on to Mark Scheifele as best as it can, stomachs that, and if things don't heal, if the leadership group does need a change, if the results aren't there, if things are toxic in some way, then the trade deadline may be a place to get that type of returner or something to that effect. The one thing I don't believe, and I feel like is important to say, I don't think there's a point of no return that has been reached. I do think that there's stress. I just don't think this is impossible to walk back. Yes, Scheifele has made his opinions known. Yes, I believe their exit interview was probably tense, but I don't think that it's impossible that he returns either.
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, anything's possible, as we've seen before. And, for a team that, has decided to stick to the guns. And it was interesting in Wyshynski's report earlier today, speaking about Paul Maurice leaving, there was sort of a weird statement. I still don't know exactly. Let me just pull it up right here, because it was very interesting, and I didn't know how to take it. But here it was. So Paul Maurice smartly walked away from the Winnipeg Jets last season. One, because it was clear he could use a refresh after a couple taxing seasons to end a 9-year run with the franchise, but also, in his words, he'd gotten everything he could out of that roster. Here's the line that was interesting. I've had a couple of sources tell me there's a stubbornness on the part of management to adapt from the veteran core of that team, so he likely got out when the getting was good. I don't know exactly what that means, to adapt from the veteran core. I mean, I guess maybe it's to move on from the veteran core, which I think certainly we would agree, considering the pattern of this team for a long time. All that being said, though, Murat, I still have the feeling that last season, the way that went, what happened around the club, and the pattern really from the middle of the 2019 season has pushed them into maybe not it being, it's obviously not a done deal, and it's not something that 100% will happen, but probably more likely than not for a number of the reasons that we've talked about today and really over the course of the last 6 months.
Yeah, and I buy that. If I'm leaning a direction, it's a direction that makes more sense to me. And I of course don't know what it was. Sorry, that was Greg's piece.
Yeah, Wyshynski.
Okay, so I don't necessarily know exactly what Wyshynski meant by that, but at the same time, it's easy for me to think about the Winnipeg Jets organization and sort of what's worked over the last little while. And Blake Wheeler staying through the prime of his career in Winnipeg, making 5 point whatever it was for so long, helping sustain a really long sort of, a window to win, that deep playoff run, the Wheeler's ability to stay here, become a part of the city, value the city, be admired by coaching, management, all those sorts of things, I think offered a certain sense of stability. Mark Scheifele as well. I believe he's close to Mark Chipman and company and really admired by them. I believe these are good people, good human beings we're talking about, and I think that's important to Jets ownership and management. I think that there's this sense that, like, I would believe if ownership and management were attached to these guys. I really would. And so maybe there's a little bit of that. That's the implication. That's kind of where my brain goes with it. And one of the reasons I go there is in the one-on-one I had with Mark Chipman last fall. I reference this often. It's the same place where he said he doesn't believe in a shelf life for coaches. He believes in continuity. He spoke really highly of every single coach that had gone through Jets or Moose doors, like Scott Arniel, like Pascal Vincent, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that he also suggested was that one of the reasons that they loved Paul Maurice was the stability from a leadership point of view that he was able to create at the top, including Blake Wheeler, that is. And I think that there's a sense that these guys are important foundational ambassador type pieces to the Jets and the way they see themselves. And then when the problem with that becomes, when what they're doing on the ice isn't matching the contract or the stage of the career, or if there's conflict, or if there's a reason to consider moving on from them, and yet they're an entrenched part of the cultural core. It works when they're driving results, winning, everybody celebrating all of the time. And now I think we're at an inflection point where those things aren't necessarily true, but the people are still valued. And I would believe the implication, I guess, is what I'm saying, without knowing the behind the scenes of what went into typing those words.
No, it's a great point. Murat, this has been an awesome conversation. Thanks so much for doing this, folks. If you haven't already, get over to theathletic.com and check out Murat's latest piece, and you can dive into all of the potential returns for Mark Scheifele, and you can be the judge as to what makes sense. Murat, have a great one, an awesome weekend, and we'll look forward to catching up next week.
Cheers, man.